For those wondering, who is Yevgeny Prigozhin, the mercenary leader of the Wagner Group, who seems set to fight his way into Moscow, the capital of nuclear-armed Russia, yesterday? We have a special report. In fact, Prigozhin has been a loyal supporter of Vladimir Putin so far. Yesterday, it seemed at one time that Prigozhin was ready to depose Putin. Before we get to the exact sequence of events in this crisis, here's a short background on Yevgeny Prigozhin. He's 62 years old. He was convicted of assault and robbery in 1981 and sentenced to 12 years in jail. He subsequently opened a restaurant business in St. Petersburg in the 90s. It's here that he became friends with Vladimir Putin, earning the label Putin's chef. Prigozhin rose up the ranks and became part of a group that revered the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. He formed the Wagner Group of mercenaries, which has seen action in Crimea in 2014 and North Africa and Syria. It has a key role to play, the Wagner Group, in Ukraine, where Russian prisoners were released and inducted into the ranks of Wagner with clear instructions. A shot at freedom that eventually resulted in the deaths of thousands of these prisoners in Wagner service. In December 2016, the US imposed sanctions on 15 Russian entities, including Mr. Prigozhin, whose Wagner Group had helped Russia annex Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. In fact, this is why if you ask any Ukrainian leader when the war started, they'll say 2014, not 2022. In February 2018, Prigozhin was indicted by a US grand jury for interfering, allegedly, in the 2016 presidential election in America by helping to spread fake news in support of Donald Trump's campaign. In October last year, things started to turn sour between Putin and Prigozhin. After being called to fight in Ukraine, Prigozhin opposed the Russian decision to withdraw from the strategic Russian city of Liman in East Ukraine. He said this withdrawal was a major embarrassment for Russia. In February this year, he's accused the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Putin's most senior general Valery Gerasimov of withholding ammunition and supplies in an effort to destroy his Wagner Group of mercenaries. Last month in May, there was another fierce volley of words when he threatened to withdraw his soldiers from the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, where eventually he was able to defeat the Ukrainian army in the fiercest and most costly battle of this war so far. This month, Yevgeny Prigozhin refused to comply with an instruction to sign an order that would require his fighters to sign a contract with the Russian Defense Ministry. Last Friday, things reached a turning point when Prigozhin said the Russian invasion to Ukraine had been a racket and that the war was not needed and that it had been enforced so that some generals could be conferred military honors. Eventually on Friday and Saturday, Prigozhin had had enough, ordering his soldiers from Ukraine into Russia, where he captured the city of Rostov, the headquarters for all Russian military operations in Ukraine, and then set the stage for a possible coup attempt in Moscow, which, as we now know, didn't eventually happen. Joined by Skand Teal, a former Indian diplomat, and Dr. Tara Karta. Thank you both very much for being with us. Dr. Tara Karta, let me come to you first. Is this not one of the most bizarre scenarios that you've seen? Because for a couple of hours, it did seem that this was an active coup attempt with Wagner forces just 200 kilometers outside Moscow. It's not the end of the crisis per se, is it? We just don't know where it's headed. That's my assessment. Is that yours?
Bizarre is right, certainly, because here's this man whose company, the so-called company Wagner, there's no company called Wagner, right? It's a series of little, all kinds of companies sort of welded together. We don't know who are the actual backers, where does the money come from, weapons come from Russia. The man whose weapons come from Russia then goes and launches a coup in Moscow. It doesn't make sense. He couldn't have done it anyway. That was our early assessment. Because there is a very solid core of the Tamanskaya troops which are surrounding Moscow. There is no way he could have got through. So he has probably, like I said earlier, I'm sorry, I said this to someone else, is that he has never been anti-Putin. He's, as you said correctly, he has been against this guy, Shoigu and the CDH. Yeah. So I think whatever conversation took place with the Belarus president sort of being a mediator, he's a Putin loyalist. I mean, look at the pictures. You may have seen them. He's serving food to Putin.
No,
he's
but
the head.
Dr. Tarakartha, that was in the past. I would suggest after a coup attempt, he is not a Putin loyalist anymore.
No,
But let me just go across to, go across to Mr. Tayal before I come back to you. Ambassador Tayal, how do you see this actually developing as far as Putin is concerned? Many would suggest that this has weakened Vladimir Putin, the strongman of Russia, to a point where he may not necessarily remain in power for an indefinite period of time, which is what people were now expecting him to remain as.
Most definitely, it has weakened President Vladimir Putin. Both Shoigu and Prigozhin are actually creations of President Putin. But they fell out and President Putin could not control that fate. Prigozhin had been making all kinds of statements against Defense Minister Shoigu, but President Putin could not control that. That shows there is some weakness in his leadership. Now, if we desegregate slightly, if we look at the Russian masses, public, even the Western ratings are that it is about 80%. So that is one part. But in the Russian army, General Shoigu, he comes from the home guards, from civil defense. He is not a blue-blooded Russian army person. So perhaps there was some dissonance between him and the lower command. And whatever happened yesterday, it shows a total failure of the military intelligence of Russia. It also shows either complicity or indifference of the Russian army, which was in Rostov-on-Don in Voronezh. Without a shot being fired, their headquarters were occupied by Prigozhin. And he marched right up to 200-300 kilometers from Moscow, but there was only one airstrike on that convoy. So there was some weakness somewhere. And after calling him a traitor and stabbing in the back, he has been pardoned. He has been, all the charges have been dropped. And Lukashenko had to be the mediator. It shows grave weakness on the part of President Putin. But I would say that in case he survives, Prigozhin survives in Belarusia, it will be an alternate center of power for Russians. He may have some resonance in the Russian army, if not among the Russian people. Even in Voronezh, etc., the local people were very nicely interacting with the Wagner troops.
No, so, and that in fact is my next question to Dr. Tarakartha. Dr. Kartha, the fact of the matter is that Prigozhin and his forces got to 200 kilometers from Moscow because the Russian army let him get there. Now, if this is the situation with the Russian army, again, is it not indicative of Putin's position within his country through the eyes of the army having weakened to a point where it might be untenable in the future?
That's what I was trying to tell you. This man, see, like we said, right now, there's all theories. One theory is that he's probably being supported by somebody within the Kremlin itself. Because as Ambassador said, there's a bunch of people who want Shoigu out of the way, that he was used for that purpose. And secondly, there are also a bunch of people in the Kremlin who are funding him. I mean, and as part of his past operations, as of now, his weapons were given. Everything is given. He's a Kremlin-funded creature. And another thing, his troops are intensely loyal to him. And he's quite terrible where his other people are concerned, but he himself is extremely, he's seen as a person who will die for his troops. So there is this bunch of people who are seen as heroes by the local population, who are not prevented by Kremlin. So what does that tell you? There is another game being played here. So this could weaken Putin perhaps, but this could very well be his ploy. Because I keep telling you, this guy is his man. He's been his man.
No,
and
ploy to what end?
Sorry?
Ploy to what end? This could be Prigozhin's ploy to what end?
Not Prigozhin's. I'm talking of Putin's ploy to get rid of a center of power in Kremlin,
But then he has the ability to sack Shoigu and Gerasimov. He doesn't need Prigozhin to mount an armed rebellion in his country.
It was not. So he backed out. See, in the end, what were the facts?
He backed out after knocking out 6 Russian aircraft from the skies. He backed out after taking control of 2 air bases, the city of Rostov-on-Don, and getting his soldiers to the outskirts almost of Moscow itself. So perhaps, it was something else. But let me just go back to Ambassador Skantayal. Sir, at the end of the day, the last thing the world needs is instability in Russia. And I think the larger picture is often forgotten since we end up speaking only about the Ukraine war. But this is a massive nuclear power, perhaps the largest nuclear power in the world. Instability in Russia could be potentially catastrophic for the rest of the world. Would you agree?
Absolutely. The instability in Russia would be catastrophic. But again, I would say that the people of Russia seem to be uninvolved to some extent. It is not on the streets of Russia. And they still seem to be enamored of President Putin's leadership. The challenge is coming from within the Russian army. Shoigu may be in a position of like just the BM call in '62, where lower down the line nobody trusts him in the Russian military itself. And President Putin, as you know, in these such systems, they want the defense minister at the top absolutely loyal to them. Because tomorrow, if there are somebody who is not totally loyal becomes the army chief or defense minister, he would say, why should I retain Putin? As we have seen repeatedly in Pakistan and elsewhere. So it is a very complex game of power. But yes, I agree, Kremlin, directly or indirectly, some people in the army are involved, because the Russian army did not confront these forces at all. Only one rocket was fired on the convoy. Where was the Russian Air Force?
Yeah.
They got chickened out. I mean, there is a lot which we still need to see, understand and analyze. But I foresee some kind of a Kremlin plot, palace coup kind of a thing, but not perhaps a civil war on the streets.
And perhaps not today. This could actually stretch out for
Yes.
some more time. Ambassador Dayal, one final question to you. What does this mean for the war in Ukraine? Do you believe that this is the beginning of the end in terms of active hostilities? And I'll tell you why. Just in terms of some of the statements made by Prigozhin, that the losses are untenable. These statements made yesterday, that they're losing at about a rate of 1,000 soldiers a day. And he's moved his soldiers out. One doesn't know if he's going to move them right back. Do you essentially see this as, and then those statements where he said that Shoigu and the others have forced this war on Russia to get medals. So these remarks, do you believe that it signifies perhaps the beginning of the end of the war in Ukraine?
In the last 6 months or so, the Russian forces have dug in very well, and all the army generals you speak to in our country, they say there are 3 lines of defense and trenches and this, that and the other. So a Ukrainian offensive will be extremely difficult, extremely costly, and will take a lot of time to dislodge the Russians. And Putin cannot lose face more. He will not withdraw. There, I see absolutely no chance of his ordering his troops to withdraw from Ukraine, because then his credibility among the Russian masses will be totally lost. So this will continue, this trench warfare or whatever you call it, this will continue in Ukraine. And the Russian army also will have to prove itself now, Shoigu, etc., and right down the line. But if the Russian army itself is so demoralized, then somebody against Putin, that why did they drag them into this Ukraine war, then again I will say there can be a palace coup or army coup, which is possible in any such authoritarian government.
All right. I'd like to thank you both very much for joining us. It's not the end of the story in Russia. The next days, weeks, perhaps months will be crucial to get an idea of what happens politically on the ground. We're out of time on Left, Right and Center. From all of us here, goodbye.